The rain fell in heavy sheets, slapping against the concrete ruins of the abandoned city as the SEAL team moved like shadows, their rifles raised, scanning every shattered window and burned-out car. Their boots splashed in shallow puddles, and every sound echoed off the hollow shells of buildings that had been torn apart by weeks of relentless fighting. The mission was already spiraling out of control. What was supposed to be a quick hostage extraction had turned into a full-scale ambush, enemy fighters lurking on every rooftop, snipers trained on every intersection. The commander signaled with a clenched fist, ordering his men to take cover behind the twisted wreckage of an overturned truck. The team moved fast, diving behind debris, their hearts pounding as bullets cracked through the air, shattering glass and chewing up concrete around them. The sound of machine gun fire was deafening, and the air was thick with smoke and the smell of burning oil. They had been pinned down for nearly 10 minutes, and already 2 men were wounded, bleeding out as the medic frantically tried to stabilize them. The enemy was smart, disciplined, and well-armed, moving like ghosts in the darkness, cutting off every escape route. Every SEAL knew this was the kind of situation that could end in a bloodbath. Yet in the midst of this chaos, there was one figure who didn't flinch, didn't crawl for cover, didn't even seem to notice the bullets screaming past her head. She stood out instantly, not because of her appearance but because of the sheer impossibility of what she was doing. The woman was dressed in plain, tactical black body armor, combat boots, a rifle slung across her back, but she wasn't moving like a soldier under fire. She wasn't low-crawling, wasn't scanning for targets, wasn't seeking shelter. She simply walked, her stride calm and unhurried, like she was taking a stroll through a quiet park instead of a war zone. The SEAL nearest to her couldn't believe what he was seeing, his breath caught in his throat as she stepped out from behind cover into the open street. Enemy muzzle flashes sparked from the rooftops, lighting up the rain-slick pavement, but she didn't duck, didn't break pace. Bullets sparked around her, cutting into asphalt, sending shards of concrete spraying, yet every shot missed her by inches as if some unseen force guided her path. Her face was hidden behind a wet strand of hair and the shadow of her hood, but her posture radiated confidence. No, more than that. It was dominance. She didn't look like someone trying to survive. She looked like someone who owned the battlefield. The SEALs, hardened warriors trained to face death head-on, felt a ripple of awe and fear run through them as they watched her. The commander hissed into his radio, demanding an identification. Who was she? Was she friend or foe? Nobody had answers. All they could do was watch as she reached over her shoulder, unslung her weapon, and leveled it at the nearest rooftop. What happened next was so fast, so precise, that it barely seemed real. One sharp crack echoed through the storm, and a sniper tumbled from his perch, his rifle clattering on the pavement below. She pivoted smoothly, firing again, and another gunman fell. The SEALs, trained for years in marksmanship, were stunned at her speed. She wasn't just accurate, she was surgical, each shot landing exactly where it needed to, neutralizing threats before they even had a chance to react. The enemy, realizing what was happening, shifted their fire toward her, but she didn't falter. She advanced steadily, her boots splashing through puddles, her weapon steady as if bolted to her shoulder. One by one the attackers fell, their positions collapsing under her relentless assault. The SEALs took the opening she created, springing from cover, returning fire, pushing forward. It was like watching a single spark ignite an inferno. The morale of the entire team surged, their fear replaced with adrenaline. For the first time in hours, the tide of battle turned in their favor. Still, even as she moved with lethal grace, there was something unsettling about her. She didn't communicate with hand signals or check her corners like a trained soldier. She didn't even seem to breathe heavily. Her movements were fluid but strange, too calm for the chaos surrounding her. One SEAL swore he saw bullets bend slightly in the air, veering just enough to miss her. Another whispered over comms that she wasn't even blinking. Yet none of that stopped them from following her lead. She cleared the street like a storm sweeping through a valley, leaving only silence and bodies in her wake. The SEAL commander finally found his voice, barking orders to his team, directing them to secure the perimeter while she strode ahead, stepping over spent casings and fallen enemies. The rain washed blood down the street in crimson rivulets, the smell of gunpowder hanging thick. She didn't stop when they reached the building where the hostages were believed to be held. The enemy had fortified it, sandbags stacked in doorways, heavy machine guns covering the entrances, but she didn't slow down. She moved with the same terrifying composure, advancing on the fortified building while the SEALs took cover again, preparing for a brutal firefight. A burst of gunfire tore into the pavement near her feet, but she didn't react. She simply raised her rifle and returned fire, the muzzle flashes lighting her face for an instant. Her eyes were cold, focused, inhumanly steady. She didn't just take down guards, she dismantled their defenses with mathematical precision, every bullet finding its mark. The SEALs joined in, storming forward, breaching the building as she covered them. Explosions rocked the entrance, smoke filled the hallways, but she walked through it all like a phantom. Inside, the scene was even more intense. Narrow corridors, dim lighting, enemy fighters entrenched behind barricades. It should have been a bloodbath for anyone trying to storm it. Yet she moved first, slipping through cover fire like she could see every trajectory, anticipate every attack. She fired without hesitation, her shots echoing through the hallways, enemies falling before they even had a chance to raise their rifles. The SEALs followed close behind, sweeping rooms, clearing stairwells, their nerves on edge as they tried to keep up with her pace. She wasn't reckless, she was unstoppable. They reached the top floor in record time, and there, locked in a room, were the hostages, 3 civilians terrified but alive. The woman holstered her weapon, knelt down, and spoke to them softly, her voice calm and soothing, almost musical. The fear in their eyes eased instantly, as if she radiated safety itself. The SEAL commander was the first to break the silence. "Who the hell are you?" he muttered under his breath, watching her help the civilians to their feet. She didn't answer. She simply turned, gesturing for the team to move. No words, no explanation. She led them out the same way she came, clearing every threat, shielding the hostages with her own body. Even as more enemy reinforcements poured into the area, she didn't waver, didn't quicken her pace. Bullets kept flying, explosions shook the ground, but she never faltered. For the SEALs, hardened men who had faced death countless times, this was something beyond comprehension. They weren't just watching bravery. They were watching someone who seemed untouchable. By the time they reached the extraction point, the street was littered with enemy bodies, their ambush utterly destroyed, their morale shattered. The rain had finally begun to let up, but the storm in their minds only grew stronger. Who was she, this fearless figure who walked through hell without flinching? None of them could answer. But they all knew one thing: their lives were no longer their own. They owed everything to her. The helicopter's rotors thundered overhead as the SEALs hustled the hostages aboard, their hands trembling from adrenaline and exhaustion. Rain and wind whipped across the landing zone, carrying the acrid scent of gunpowder and charred metal from the battle they had barely survived. The woman stood at the edge of the extraction zone, her dark hair plastered to her face, her weapon lowered but ready. She wasn't breathing hard, wasn't trembling, wasn't reacting like the rest of them. She stood perfectly still, scanning the shadows beyond the ruined buildings as if expecting another wave of attackers. The SEAL commander, drenched and bleeding from a grazing wound on his arm, barked orders at his men, but his eyes kept flicking toward her, unease gnawing at the edges of his disciplined composure. She had turned the tide of an unwinnable firefight and dismantled a fortified enemy position practically alone, yet she carried herself like it hadn't cost her a single drop of energy. The commander's instincts screamed at him that she wasn't just another operative, wasn't just another soldier. There was something else about her, something he couldn't put into words. "Get in," he called over the roar of the helicopter, motioning her forward. She didn't move at first. She just stared into the distance, eyes narrowing slightly as if she could see through the fog and smoke. Then, without a word, she turned and stepped into the helicopter, sliding onto the bench opposite the hostages. The SEALs piled in around her, their rifles still trained outward, scanning the perimeter for threats. The pilot lifted off, the helicopter shaking as it ascended through the rainstorm, banking hard over the shattered remains of the city below. From above, the devastation was even clearer. Entire blocks reduced to rubble, craters from airstrikes scarring the streets, fires still burning despite the downpour. The SEAL team sat in tense silence, their breaths loud over the engine's roar, each man lost in thought. The hostages clung to each other, eyes wide, tears cutting paths through the dirt on their faces. And across from them, she sat motionless, her hands resting on her knees, her gaze fixed on the floor. One of the SEALs, a burly operator named Jenkins, finally broke the silence. "Who the hell are you?" His voice was low but filled with a mix of awe and suspicion. She didn't answer. She didn't even look at him. The commander shot Jenkins a sharp look, signaling him to back off. "We'll find out soon enough," the commander muttered, though the words rang hollow even to him. He glanced at her again, at the calmness that seemed unnatural after what they'd just gone through. She wasn't like anyone he'd ever seen, and he'd seen a lot in his years of black ops. The way she had moved through that battlefield wasn't luck or training. It was something beyond either of those things. Something that defied explanation. Half an hour later, the helicopter touched down at a secure forward operating base, the landing pad illuminated by harsh floodlights cutting through the misty night. Armed soldiers rushed to escort the hostages inside, medics sweeping in to check the SEAL's wounds. The commander stepped off the ramp, barking orders, but his attention was fixed on her as she descended slowly, her eyes scanning the base with the same quiet intensity she had shown in the field. She moved with purpose, yet there was no urgency in her steps, no sign of exhaustion. She was a ghost among men, gliding through the chaos as if none of it touched her. The base commander, a grizzled colonel with a face like carved stone, strode over, his voice sharp. "Where's the rest of the enemy?" "Dead," the SEAL commander replied bluntly, stripping off his helmet. "Every last one of them." The colonel's eyes narrowed. "How?" The SEAL commander hesitated, glancing over his shoulder at her. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you." The colonel followed his gaze and stiffened slightly. The woman stood a few feet away, her expression unreadable, her hands clasped loosely behind her back. She was soaked from head to toe, streaks of mud and blood marking her armor, but her posture was impeccable, almost regal. For a moment the colonel said nothing, simply studying her. Then he gave a curt nod, gesturing for her to follow. She didn't move. "Who are you?" the colonel asked, his voice low but commanding. Finally she turned her head and met his gaze. Her eyes were striking, icy, piercing, with a depth that made even the battle-hardened colonel pause. When she spoke, her voice was calm, measured, almost soothing. "That's not important right now. What matters is that your enemy won't be a problem anymore." The colonel frowned, clearly unsatisfied with the answer, but something in her tone made him hesitate. There was no arrogance in her voice, no hostility, just quiet certainty. He turned to the SEAL commander. "Debrief in 1 hour. Bring her too." As the colonel walked away, the commander approached her. "You're coming with me." She studied him for a moment, then gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. They led her into a secure briefing room deep within the base, a small, windowless chamber with dim lighting and a single metal table. The walls were lined with monitors showing live drone feeds of the city they just left behind. The commander gestured for her to sit, but she remained standing, her hands resting lightly on the back of a chair. "We lost 2 men today," he said, his voice steady but heavy. "But if it weren't for you, we'd have lost everyone. That's not something I say lightly." She didn't respond. The commander sighed, leaning back against the wall. "I need to know who you are. We don't work with unknowns. You just wiped out an entire insurgent force single-handedly, and nobody here has ever seen you before. If you're not going to talk, then you're a liability." Finally she spoke, her voice so soft he had to lean in to hear. "I'm not your enemy." "That's not good enough," he said firmly. She tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "Then don't trust me. Just remember that I kept you alive today." The commander clenched his jaw, frustrated. "That's not how this works. Out here we need to know who we're fighting alongside. You don't just walk into a battlefield like you're bulletproof and not expect questions." "I don't expect anything," she said simply. The door opened and the colonel entered, his presence filling the small room. He glanced between the commander and the woman, his sharp gaze lingering on her. "We ran your face through every database we have," he said without preamble. "Nothing. No ID, no military record, no agency ties. You're a ghost." She smiled faintly, the first flicker of emotion they'd seen from her. "Maybe I am." The colonel slammed his hand on the table. "This isn't a game. You show up out of nowhere, single-handedly turn a massacre into a victory, and you expect us to just accept that?" Her smile faded. She leaned forward slightly, her voice lowering to a whisper that somehow carried more weight than a shout. "I don't expect anything from you. I came because I knew they were going to die. And because I needed to send a message." "A message to who?" the commander asked, his voice tense. She looked at him, then really looked at him, and for a moment he felt a chill crawl down his spine. "To the ones who sent them." The colonel stared at her, his face a mask of suspicion and controlled anger. "The ones who sent them?" he repeated slowly, his voice low and dangerous. "You mean the insurgents?" She shook her head, just barely. "No. The ones behind them. The ones you don't see. The ones you pretend aren't there because it's easier to believe you're fighting rebels with rifles instead of architects with entire armies at their disposal." Her tone was calm, almost eerily so, as if she was reciting a fact rather than making an accusation. The colonel took a step closer, trying to read her expression, but her face was blank, her eyes steady, giving nothing away. "You need to explain yourself," he said firmly. For a long moment she didn't respond. The tension in the room grew heavier with each second. The commander shifted uncomfortably, his fingers drumming against the rifle slung across his chest. Outside, the muffled hum of generators and the distant thud of helicopters reminded them they were still in a war zone, still vulnerable. Finally she spoke, her voice so soft that both men had to lean in to hear her clearly. "They weren't there to stop you from rescuing those civilians," she said. "They were there to send a message to. That message was meant for me." The colonel frowned. "And who the hell are you to warrant a message like that?" Her lips curved into the faintest trace of a smile, but it wasn't one of amusement. "I'm the reason their plan is falling apart." She straightened slowly, her posture still relaxed but radiating an unmistakable sense of authority. "You think you're fighting a regional militia. That's the illusion they want you to believe. But you've already seen enough to know this is bigger. The weapons they carry, the coordination, the resources, this isn't a scattered rebellion. This is a machine. And I've been dismantling that machine piece by piece for longer than you can imagine." The colonel didn't respond right away. His instincts screamed that she wasn't lying, though the truth was hard to swallow. He'd spent years commanding troops, fighting what they were told were small insurgencies, yet her words mirrored a suspicion he'd harbored deep down for years, that something about this war never added up. "You're not military," he said finally. "No," she said simply. "Agency?" the commander pressed. "CIA, DIA, some Black Ops division we haven't been cleared to know about?" She shook her head. "I don't work for any government. I don't answer to anyone but myself." The colonel scowled, crossing his arms. "Then who are you really? Mercenary? Assassin? Vigilante?" "None of those words matter," she said. "What matters is that I know what's coming. Tonight was just a test, a demonstration of what they can do. If they'd wanted to, none of you would have made it out alive." The commander felt his stomach tighten. "You're saying they let us live?" She met his gaze steadily. "No. I'm saying I didn't let them kill you." The colonel's jaw clenched. He had no idea why, but a part of him believed her completely. He had seen her walk through a storm of bullets untouched, watched her dismantle an entire battalion with precision and ease that no human soldier could replicate. She wasn't exaggerating. She wasn't bluffing. She was telling him a hard truth that he didn't want to face. He opened his mouth to press her further, but the room suddenly went dark as alarms blared through the base. The lights flickered, and then red emergency strobes began to pulse, bathing the room in a hellish glow. "Contact!" a voice shouted over the base intercom. "Multiple hostiles inbound, north perimeter breached." The colonel cursed, snapping into command mode. "Lock this base down. Get those civilians secured." He turned to the commander. "Get your team geared up. We're under attack." The commander nodded, grabbing his rifle. He looked to the woman, expecting her to follow orders, but she was already moving toward the door. "Wait," he called. "You're not cleared." She glanced over her shoulder, and he froze under the weight of her gaze. "Stay behind me if you want to live," she said quietly, then slipped out into the corridor. The commander hesitated for a second, then followed her, his instincts telling him that wherever she was going was the safest place to be. The base was chaos. Soldiers scrambled through the halls, weapons raised, shouting orders as gunfire erupted in the distance. Explosions shook the ground beneath their feet, rattling ceiling panels. The smell of burning fuel filled the air, and the distant whine of incoming drones pierced through the alarms. They reached the main entrance of the operations building just as a blast tore through the outer wall, sending soldiers flying backward. Shrapnel sprayed through the air, and the commander threw himself behind cover, but she didn't even flinch. She stepped through the smoke, her rifle snapping to her shoulder, and opened fire. What followed was a blur. Enemy troops poured into the base like a tide, their weapons blazing. The defenders were disciplined, but the attackers were faster, more aggressive, and seemingly unafraid of death. They moved with terrifying coordination, cutting through the perimeter defenses with ruthless precision. The woman met them head-on, moving like a predator through the chaos. She fired without hesitation, her shots perfect, every round finding a target. She ducked under a grenade blast, spun, and dropped 3 men with 3 shots in less than a second. The commander followed in her wake, providing cover, but it was clear she didn't need it. She was a force of nature, a storm given human form, and the enemy broke against her like waves crashing on rocks. But they weren't just here to kill. The attackers were pushing toward the command center, ignoring casualties, driving deeper into the base with singular focus. The colonel's voice barked orders over the radio, but his men were being overwhelmed. The commander stayed close to her as she advanced, his heart hammering in his chest. She wasn't rushing, wasn't panicking, just moving with lethal efficiency. He realized then that she was guiding them, not just fighting. Every shot she fired, every step she took was carefully calculated, leading them down a path that seemed to predict the enemy's movements before they even happened. They reached the heart of the base where the command center was located, and found it already under siege. Enemy fighters had breached the outer doors, pinning the defenders down with heavy gunfire. The colonel himself was there, crouched behind a flipped table, returning fire with grim determination. He glanced up as they arrived, his eyes widening as he saw her stride into the line of fire. "What the hell are you doing?" he shouted. She didn't answer. She simply moved forward, unloading a precise burst that cut down the gunners at the door. She kicked the door open and swept inside, her movements faster than the commander's eyes could follow. The gunfire ceased within seconds, replaced by an eerie silence. When they entered the room behind her, every attacker was dead. She stood in the center of the carnage, reloading calmly, her expression unreadable. The colonel lowered his rifle slowly, breathing hard. "You're not human," he muttered, the words slipping out before he could stop them. She looked at him with those icy eyes and said nothing. The colonel's words hung in the air like a challenge, but she gave no reaction. The pulsing red emergency lights cast strange shadows on her face, making her look otherworldly. The commander tightened his grip on his rifle, trying to steady his breathing as his eyes darted over the bodies sprawled across the command center. None of the attackers had survived. Each one lay exactly where they had fallen, bullet holes placed with surgical precision, no wasted shots, no sign of panic in their final moments. It wasn't a firefight, it was an execution carried out with terrifying efficiency. She finished reloading, her movements smooth, almost elegant, then turned her gaze back toward the colonel, who was still staring at her like he was seeing something he couldn't comprehend. "Who are they working for?" he asked finally, voice low but firm. "They're not working for anyone you've heard of," she said softly, her voice carrying clearly in the silence. "These men aren't soldiers. They're assets. Disposable tools sent to bleed you, to make you afraid, to let you know they're watching." She moved past him, crouching to inspect one of the fallen attackers. The man was heavily armed and armored, his uniform devoid of insignias or identifiers. She pulled a small blade from her belt, sliced open his vest, and revealed a thin patch sewn on the inside. It wasn't a flag or a rank symbol, it was a black triangle with a single silver dot in the center. The colonel frowned, kneeling beside her. "That means something to you?" he asked. "Yes," she said quietly. "It means they're escalating." "Escalating what?" the commander asked. "War," she said, her eyes meeting his for a moment. "Not the one you think you're fighting. A different war. One that's been in motion for years, hidden in plain sight." She rose smoothly, stepping over the bodies, her calmness a stark contrast to the chaos that had just erupted. "They're going to hit again. This wasn't meant to destroy your base. This was meant to measure your response time, your defenses, your weaknesses. And now they know." The colonel clenched his fists. "Then tell me how to stop them." She gave him a long, steady look. "You can't." The room fell silent. Even the commander, who had begun to suspect that she operated on a level beyond anything they understood, felt his chest tighten at the cold certainty in her tone. "If we can't stop them," the colonel growled, "then what are we supposed to do? Just wait for them to wipe us out." Her eyes softened slightly, though her voice remained calm. "No. You can't stop them, but I can." The colonel studied her, his military mind working overtime, trying to reconcile what he'd seen with what she was saying. He wanted to dismiss her words, to call them arrogance, but deep down he couldn't. He had witnessed her walk through a war zone like a ghost, dismantling a small army without breaking a sweat. She wasn't boasting. She was telling him a fact, and that terrified him more than any enemy ever had. "Then you'd better start talking," he said finally. "Because I'm not in the habit of trusting ghosts." She glanced around the room at the monitors, the radios, the soldiers recovering from the firefight outside, and her jaw tightened. "This isn't the place. They're listening." The colonel narrowed his eyes. "Who's listening?" She didn't answer. Instead, she walked to one of the dead attackers, knelt, and pulled something from his belt pouch, a small device no larger than a coin, blinking faintly with a red light. She held it up between her fingers, and the colonel's face hardened. "Tracker?" he asked. "Worse," she said. "Surveillance." Every one of these men was carrying one. Everything they saw, everything they heard, was transmitted to someone watching from a safe distance. "They already know we're standing here talking." The commander swore under his breath. We're compromised. Completely, she said. But they won't attack again tonight. They've got what they came for. She dropped the device on the floor and crushed it beneath her boot. We need to leave. Leave? The colonel barked. This is a fortified base. It's a trap, she interrupted sharply, her calm voice suddenly carrying steel. Every second you spend here is another second they're planning your destruction. This base will not survive another attack, and the next one will be precise. Surgical. No alarms, no firefights. Just a crater where this place used to stand. If you want to live, if you want your men and those civilians to live, you'll abandon this base now. The colonel's face darkened, anger and disbelief warring with the creeping dread in his gut. Do you have any idea what you're asking? This base is classified. The coordinates aren't supposed to be known to anyone outside our chain of command. She stepped closer, her piercing eyes locking onto his. And yet they're watching us right now. That should tell you everything you need to know about how deep their reach goes. The colonel stared at her for a long moment, then turned to the commander. Get your men. Prep the hostages. We're evacuating. The commander blinked. Sir, are you sure? Do it, the colonel snapped. His voice was hard, but there was a tremor of fear beneath it. The commander nodded and moved quickly, barking orders into his radio. Soldiers sprang into action, gathering intel, loading gear, and moving the civilians toward the landing pad. The base erupted into organized chaos, but the woman remained calm, standing perfectly still in the middle of the command center, her rifle resting lightly in her hands. She watched everything, her eyes flicking to every shadow, every corner, as if expecting an attack at any moment. Within 20 minutes, the evacuation was underway. Helicopters thundered overhead, their searchlights cutting through the night as soldiers poured out of the compound, forming protective perimeters around the hostages. The colonel approached her, his face grim. You're coming with us, he said firmly. She tilted her head slightly. Of course. They moved together toward the landing pad, the sound of rotor blades deafening as the first chopper lifted off with the hostages and a squad of SEALs. The woman paused for a moment, glancing back at the base. The red lights still flashed inside, illuminating the empty halls. For a brief moment, something flickered across her face, something almost like sorrow. Then she turned away and climbed into the next helicopter. The commander followed, settling into a seat across from her, his rifle across his lap. The aircraft shook as it lifted off, and the base grew smaller beneath them, a cluster of lights swallowed by darkness. He watched her as she sat completely still, eyes closed, breathing steady as if she were meditating. He couldn't hold his question back any longer. What are you? He asked softly, his voice barely audible over the roar of the engines. She opened her eyes and looked at him, and for the briefest moment he thought he saw something ancient there, something vast and dangerous. She didn't smile, didn't answer right away. Instead, she leaned forward slightly, her voice calm but carrying a weight that made his skin prickle. I'm the reason they're afraid, she said. The colonel, seated beside the pilot, turned his head sharply, but before he could speak, a flash of light bloomed on the horizon. The commander's stomach dropped as he saw it, a massive explosion ripping through the night, so bright it lit up the clouds above. It took him a moment to realize what he was seeing. The base. Their base. A split second later, the shockwave hit, rattling the helicopter and knocking a few soldiers against the walls. The explosion was devastating, a towering plume of fire and debris rising where their fortress had stood only minutes earlier. Gasps filled the cabin, and the colonel swore violently, gripping his headset. She didn't even flinch. She just watched the destruction with those unreadable eyes, then turned her gaze back to him. That, she said softly, was their second move. The shockwave's roar faded into the distance, but its echo lingered in every heart on that helicopter. Soldiers sat in stunned silence, gripping their weapons tighter, their faces pale in the dim red interior lighting. The base they had believed was impenetrable was now nothing more than a burning crater. The colonel's jaw was tight, his knuckles white as he clutched the edge of his seat. No one spoke, but the silence was deafening, heavy with fear and disbelief. The commander's eyes darted to her, seeking some reaction, but she remained perfectly still. She was watching the fireball recede behind them, her expression unreadable. The only movement was the slow, rhythmic rise and fall of her chest. Finally, the colonel broke the silence. How? His voice cracked, filled with disbelief and rage. How did they know? How could they? He stopped himself, clenching his fists so hard they trembled. They've been inside your systems for months, she said softly, her calm voice cutting through the noise of the rotors. Every call you've made, every encrypted transmission you've sent, Every base you think is hidden, they know. They've been letting you think you were winning while they mapped every piece of your network. She turned her gaze to him, her eyes sharp and piercing. This wasn't about your base. It was about sending a message. To you. To me. To everyone who thinks they're safe. The colonel swallowed hard, his pride wounded by the implication. He wanted to argue to say she was wrong, but deep down he knew she was right. The scale of the attack, the precision, the timing, it was too perfect. They'd been playing into someone else's hands all along. The commander leaned forward, his voice low. You knew this would happen. It wasn't a question. She didn't deny it. I suspected, she said, her tone unchanging. That's why I was there tonight. Not to save your team, though that was necessary, but to confirm their strategy. They've grown bolder. That means they're close to their goal. And what goal is that? The colonel demanded. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached into her vest and pulled out a small black case, no larger than a deck of cards. She placed it on her lap, flipping it open to reveal a sleek tablet-like device with no logos or markings. The screen flickered to life, showing a map of the region, but this wasn't any standard military map. It was alive, pulsing with red and blue points of light, shifting and updating in real time. The commander leaned closer, realizing what he was seeing: satellite feeds, troop movements, encrypted communications intercepts, all layered into a seamless interface. This is everything, she said, her voice low. Every hostile movement, every target they've hit or plan to hit. It's not just this region. It's global. They're not just fighting a war here. They're orchestrating a chain reaction that will destabilize everything you think is secure. She tapped a section of the map, zooming out to show the entire continent. Red points dotted it like drops of blood, clusters of enemy forces hidden in places that should have been friendly territory. They're already inside your borders. Inside your cities. Inside your systems. And they've been there long enough that removing them now will be almost impossible. The colonel's face hardened. You're saying we've already lost? No, she said, looking up at him with those piercing eyes. I'm saying you've already lost control. There's a difference. The helicopter hit turbulence, jostling everyone, but she didn't even blink. Her calm was unnerving, as if she existed in a different rhythm than everyone else. The colonel rubbed a hand over his face, the weight of her words pressing down on him. He had spent his entire career believing he was part of the strongest military machine on the planet, yet she was dismantling that illusion with every word. The commander finally spoke. Then what's your plan? You said you can stop them. How? She studied him for a long moment before closing the device and sliding it back into her vest. By doing what none of you can, she said simply. Going to the source. The colonel frowned. And where's that? Her lips curved into the faintest trace of a smile, but it wasn't comforting. Deep enough that you'd never come back out. The commander felt a chill creep up his spine at her words. He glanced at the soldiers around him, battle-hardened men who had faced death countless times, and saw the same unease mirrored in their faces. She wasn't speaking in riddles to sound mysterious, she was stating a fact. Wherever she was going, it wasn't a place for mortals. The colonel's voice grew sharper. You're talking like this is bigger than nations. Bigger than governments. Are you saying this is some kind of shadow organization? It's not a shadow, she said softly. It's the world you don't see because you were never meant to. Governments don't run things the way you think. Wars don't start because of politics or resources. There's always a hand behind the curtain guiding the pieces. And right now, that hand is about to close its fist. The colonel clenched his jaw. And you expect us to just trust you? Follow you? No, she said calmly. I expect you to survive. If you're smart, you'll take those civilians and disappear. Erase yourselves. Start over somewhere else. That's not an option, the colonel snapped. We don't run. She tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. Then you'll die. Every one of you. Just like the men who built that base. The words hung heavy in the cabin, and no one dared to speak for a long moment. Outside the helicopter, the storm had cleared, revealing a star-filled sky. The destruction they'd left behind was just a faint orange glow on the horizon now. The commander studied her, his mind racing. Everything about her defied explanation. The way she fought, the way she spoke, the way she seemed to know things no one else could. Yet he felt an undeniable pull toward her words, like some instinct buried deep inside him recognized the truth she carried. The pilot's voice crackled over the comms. ETA 5 minutes to fallback position. The colonel straightened, forcing himself to regain his composure. We'll regroup, he said firmly. Reinforce. Then we'll hunt them. She turned her gaze to him, her voice quiet but sharp as a blade. You won't get the chance. They'll hunt you first. They already know where you're going. They knew where you were before. They're always ahead of you because they built the game you're playing. You're still thinking like a soldier. They're not soldiers. They're predators. And predators always circle before they strike. The colonel bristled at her words, but the commander noticed something in her tone. It wasn't arrogance. It was experience. It spoke like someone who had seen this before, someone who knew how predators thought because she had been one, or worse, had fought them long enough to understand their every move. The helicopter dipped lower as the fallback site came into view, a secluded plateau surrounded by forest. Floodlights lit the landing zone, but something about it felt wrong to her. She leaned slightly toward the window, her expression tightening. The commander noticed and followed her gaze, scanning the treeline, but he saw nothing unusual. Still, his gut twisted. Pilot, she said suddenly, her calm voice cutting through the radio chatter. Abort landing. The colonel turned sharply. What? Why? Her eyes flicked toward him, and he felt a chill run through him at the steel in her gaze. Because they're waiting for us. The pilot hesitated for a fraction of a second, his hands hovering over the controls, then instinctively pulled back on the cyclic, lifting the helicopter away from the landing zone. The colonel barked into his comm, demanding answers, but she ignored him, her focus fixed on the glowing perimeter below. Her gaze sharpened, scanning every shadow, every flicker of movement between the trees. She didn't need night vision goggles or infrared scanners to know what was there. The silence of the forest was too complete, too staged. The bright landing lights didn't illuminate safety, they painted targets. Climb, she ordered the pilot, her tone calm but edged with authority that brooked no argument. Hard and fast. Keep us unpredictable. Zigzag, no straight path. The colonel gritted his teeth but didn't countermand her. Something in her voice carried a weight he couldn't ignore, a quiet certainty that came only from someone who had been here before. As the helicopter banked sharply, a sudden flash of light erupted below. A missile streaked from the treeline, cutting through the night sky with a serpent's hiss. The pilot yanked the stick, sending the helicopter into a gut-wrenching dive. The missile passed so close that its heat washed over the fuselage, rattling every bolt and rivet. Flares, the commander barked, and the pilot responded instantly. Bright decoys burst into the sky, painting the forest in stark, flashing light. In that momentary illumination, the soldiers saw them, dozens of figures in matte black armor, slipping through the trees like wraiths. Their faces were covered, their weapons sleek and silent. They weren't a ragtag militia or insurgents. These were professionals. Elite killers. They knew our extraction point, the commander muttered, gripping his rifle tighter. They knew everything, she said calmly, watching the figures below vanish back into the shadows. They've been ahead of you from the start. That's why we're not going to land. We're going to make them chase us. And then, her eyes narrowed. We'll make them regret it. The colonel spun toward her, incredulous. Make them regret it? There are more of them down there than we have bullets. We're outnumbered and outgunned. She finally turned to face him fully, her gaze as steady as stone. That's because you're still fighting the wrong kind of war, she said. You're playing defense. They're not. Her words cut through the chaos, silencing him. The helicopter jolted again as another missile fired, this one arcing high. The pilot dove and twisted, sending the aircraft skimming dangerously close to the treetops. Soldiers clung to their seats, knuckles white, but she stood, unstrapping herself, moving with eerie balance through the swaying cabin. She approached the door gunner, who was clutching his mounted machine gun, scanning for targets. Switch, she said softly. The gunner hesitated, glancing at the commander for confirmation. The commander gave a slight nod and the soldier stepped aside. She took his place effortlessly, her movements fluid. Her fingers brushed over the weapon, checking it with the speed and confidence of someone who had lived with weapons her entire life. Then she looked out over the dark forest, her expression shifting. She didn't just see enemies. She felt them, sensed them like she was reading an invisible map of their positions. Her breathing slowed. Time seemed to stretch around her. When she squeezed the trigger, the roar of the machine gun filled the cabin, deafening, but there was nothing wild or frantic in her fire. Every burst was precise, controlled, each spray of bullets stitching through the treeline with surgical accuracy. The first target went down with a muffled cry. The second didn't even have time to react. Soldiers on board exchanged stunned looks. She was moving faster than their eyes could track, pivoting, firing, and cutting down enemies they couldn't even see. Keep moving, she shouted over the gunfire, her voice like steel. The pilot banked hard, skimming the edge of a canyon now, trying to shake the incoming fire. Below, another squad of black-armored figures sprinted through the trees, their rifles raised, but she had already sighted them. She fired a short, brutal burst, cutting them down before they could get into position. The commander felt a chill watching her. She wasn't just good, she was operating on a level that didn't seem human. "She's not missing," one of the soldiers whispered in awe. "She's not even missing." The colonel's eyes narrowed. There was no fear in her. Not even adrenaline. She was too calm, too deliberate, as though she'd known this would happen down to the last detail. "Who the hell are you?" he muttered under his breath, but she didn't answer. A third missile streaked toward them, fired from deeper in the woods. The pilot yanked the controls, but this one was locked. The commander's stomach dropped as the missile closed in, but then she did something that made no sense. She stopped firing, leaned halfway out of the door, and stared directly at the approaching streak of fire. "Hold steady," she said. The pilot froze, terrified but obeying. "Are you insane?" the colonel shouted. Her hand moved to her vest, pulling out something small and cylindrical. She yanked a pin with her teeth, then hurled it with a motion so fast it was almost a blur. The object streaked through the night and detonated midair, just feet from the missile. The shockwave slammed against the helicopter, rattling everyone inside. For a terrifying second, the missile seemed to stay on course, but then its guidance failed. It spun wildly and veered away, disappearing into the forest below with a fiery explosion. The cabin was silent, stunned. What was that?" the commander asked, his voice hoarse. "EMP disruptor," she said, already turning back to the gun. "Single use. I only had one. So don't get hit again." Her voice was calm, but her eyes flicked toward the sky, searching. She knew they weren't out of danger yet. The helicopter climbed higher, breaking free of the treeline, but her instincts screamed that they were still being tracked. She slung the machine gun back into position and motioned for the pilot. "Take us north. 10 clicks. There's a ridge there. You'll land me." The colonel turned on her. "You think I'm dropping you off alone? That's suicide." "It's not suicide," she said, locking eyes with him. "It's the only way you'll survive the next hour. They're hunting me. Not you. I'm the reason that base is ash. I'm the reason they're firing at us right now. If I'm gone, they'll stop chasing you. You think I'm just going to let you walk out into their hands?" the commander growled. She held his gaze, unflinching. "No. I think you're smart enough to listen when someone tells you how to keep your men alive. Stay on this bird, go dark, and disappear. If you come with me, you'll all die." Her words landed like a punch. She wasn't pleading, she was certain. The commander hated that he believed her. The helicopter roared through the night, every man inside wrestling with fear and doubt. She stood calm, her silhouette sharp against the open door, scanning the stars like she was reading a language only she understood. When the ridge appeared below, jagged and steep, she grabbed her gear and clipped herself to a rope. "Good luck," she said quietly to the commander as she stepped into the doorway. Before he could respond, she leapt into the darkness, vanishing into the night like a shadow swallowed by the forest. The wind tore at her as she descended, the rope hissing through her gloved hands. The forest rushed up to meet her, dark and endless, the jagged ridge illuminated only by the fading glow of the helicopter's lights above. She landed silently, knees bending to absorb the impact, and in one smooth motion unclipped the rope and melted into the shadows. By the time the helicopter banked away, she was already gone, a phantom disappearing into the night. The forest was alive with danger. She could hear it, the faint crunch of boots moving through undergrowth, the distant hum of drones sweeping the sky, the subtle rhythm of communication between enemies who thought themselves hunters. She crouched low, her body still, her breathing so controlled it barely disturbed the air. Every sense sharpened, tuned to the vibrations of this hostile world. She could smell oil and metal on the breeze, the residue of machines and weapons that didn't belong to the wild. She moved swiftly, ghost-like, slipping between the trees with a predator's grace. Every step was calculated, her feet finding soft patches of moss or earth that wouldn't betray her with a crack of a twig. She carried her rifle in one hand, but her primary weapon now was awareness. She didn't need to see them to know where they were. She could feel the pressure of their presence, the way predators can feel other predators lurking just out of sight. A faint glow flickered through the trees ahead, a drone hovering low, scanning the forest floor with an infrared beam. She froze, pressing herself against the trunk of an ancient tree, her mind calculating angles, paths, and timing. The drone's beam swept toward her position, but she was already in motion. She slid low to the ground, rolled beneath a fallen log, and waited as the light passed over her hiding spot. The drone's hum moved on, oblivious, and she exhaled silently. She didn't try to shoot it down. That would only alert them. Instead, she let it pass, then changed direction, looping wide to come in behind it. Moving uphill, she reached a vantage point that gave her a glimpse of her hunters. They were spread out in a tight formation, black armored figures with sleek rifles and visors that glimmered faintly in the moonlight. Their movements were coordinated, practiced. They weren't searching blindly, they were sweeping methodically, a net tightening around her. She studied them for a moment, her mind calculating. There were at least 20 in this group alone, and if she knew anything about the organization hunting her, there were more scattered through the woods, plus drones and likely satellite feeds feeding their every movement back to a command center. Taking them all head-on would be suicide. But that wasn't her plan. She slid a hand into her vest and retrieved a small device no bigger than a coin. She pressed a button, and it emitted a faint pulse of static before going dark. A signal jammer, short range, enough to disrupt communication in a small radius. She placed it under a rock and moved again, vanishing into the trees. Minutes later, she watched from a hidden perch as the squad passed through the area. Their radios crackled uselessly, voices cutting in and out. Confusion rippled through their formation, their movements slowing, hesitation creeping in. She smiled faintly. Hesitation was an opening. She slipped silently behind the last man in the formation. A hand clamped over his mouth, and a blade slid between the gaps in his armor with surgical precision. She eased him down without a sound, his body disappearing into the ferns. She stripped his sidearm and comm device, examined it quickly and tossed the radio aside, useless without a working signal. Two more fell just as silently, taken from behind before they realized their squad was being thinned. By the time the others noticed something was wrong, she was already gone, her shadow flitting between trees. Panic began to ripple through their ranks, their calm precision unraveling as they realized their perfect net had a hole in it, and the prey was inside. She retreated to higher ground, crouching on a narrow ridge that gave her a vantage point over the valley below. From here she could see the faint glow of their searchlights sweeping the forest floor, the flicker of infrared beams cutting through the mist. Her mind was already 2 steps ahead, plotting routes, anticipating their next moves. They would tighten their perimeter. They would call in reinforcements. They would try to pin her against the ridge. She reached into her pack and pulled out a small case, flipping it open to reveal a set of compact, collapsible devices, mines each no bigger than a hand. She placed them strategically along the ridge, concealed beneath leaves and dirt. They weren't designed to kill, they were designed to disorient, to blind, to sow chaos. By the time they closed in on her position, she wouldn't be there. Her hands moved with mechanical efficiency, but her mind was far away, back to a time when she wasn't the one being hunted. Back when she'd been the one sent to hunt others. She remembered forests like this one, jungles, deserts, city streets at night. Missions she hadn't wanted to take but had been ordered to complete. Faces she couldn't forget. The organization that had trained her hadn't just made her a weapon. They'd made her their ghost, a myth whispered among enemies. But tonight the myth was being hunted. A sound snapped her back to the present, a twig breaking somewhere behind her, faint but deliberate. She froze, her rifle swinging up in a smooth arc. The forest was silent again, too silent. She adjusted her position, slow and steady, her finger resting lightly on the trigger. A shadow moved through the mist, a silhouette almost invisible against the trees. She held her breath, waiting, her mind analyzing every detail. The enemy was good, silent, disciplined, aware. This wasn't one of the rank-and-file hunters. This was someone like her. She lowered herself slowly, melting into the earth, becoming part of the landscape. The shadow moved closer, pausing just a few feet away, scanning the ridge with a predator's patience. She could see the glint of a visor, the faint ripple of breath in the mist. Her heart slowed to a crawl, her body completely still. When she struck, it was a blur of motion. She sprang forward, grabbing the shadow's rifle and wrenching it aside, her knees slamming into their chest. They fought back instantly, their strength impressive, but she was faster, her blade flashing as it caught the weak point in their armor. The figure went down, gasping for breath. She crouched over them, pulling their visor up just enough to see their face. A young man barely older than 20. His eyes widened in recognition, fear mixing with awe. "It's you," he whispered, his voice trembling. She didn't answer. She silenced him quickly and moved on, but his words echoed in her mind. They knew her. Whoever was running this hunt, they hadn't sent amateurs. They'd sent people who knew her, who'd studied her. She needed to get ahead of them. Moving swiftly, she climbed higher, using the steep ridge to gain distance. Behind her, faint voices crackled as the rest of the squad discovered their fallen. She reached the top of the ridge and crouched low, scanning the forest below. Lights danced through the trees as reinforcements poured in, a tightening web of firepower. She closed her eyes briefly, mapping their positions in her mind. This wasn't just an extraction gone wrong. This was a trap designed specifically for her. Which meant she was close to something, or someone, they desperately didn't want her to reach. Her lips curved in a faint smile, more predator than prey. Good, she murmured softly to herself. She vanished over the ridge, moving deeper into the forest, drawing them further into her game. The forest was no longer silent. The hum of drones filled the air, their searchlights sweeping methodically across the terrain. Boots crunched on leaves and gravel, distant shouts of commands echoing through the trees. They had her boxed in, or at least they thought they did. From her perch high in the canopy, she watched the formation shift and tighten. Dozens of armored figures moved below like pieces on a chessboard, and she saw the patterns clearly. They were herding her toward a clearing where a helicopter waited. A capture zone. They weren't here to kill her, not yet. They wanted her alive. That was their first mistake. She crouched on a branch, perfectly balanced, the bark cool beneath her gloves. She could feel her heartbeat slow, her breathing steady. Below, the lead squad approached a choke point she'd marked hours ago. The mines were buried deep, almost invisible, and calibrated to trigger only from a certain weight. She waited until they were all inside the kill zone. Then, with a flick of her thumb, she detonated them. The night erupted in white light and thunder. Flashbangs exploded in quick succession, blinding and deafening the soldiers. Smoke hissed from hidden canisters, a thick, choking cloud that turned their perfect formation into chaos. She moved instantly, dropping from the tree like a predator swooping on prey. The first soldier never saw her coming. She struck him with surgical precision, a blade sliding through the gaps in his armor. Before he hit the ground, she had his rifle and turned it on the second. 3 short bursts and the path was clear. She disappeared into the smoke before the rest could regroup. The forest came alive with shouts, gunfire cracking through the mist, tracer rounds streaking through the trees like fireflies. But she wasn't there to trade bullets. She moved in a rhythm, a dance she had learned through years of brutal training. She knew how they would react, how they would panic, where they would retreat. She was already ahead of them, circling, striking, and vanishing. A squad broke formation to flank her position, unaware she was already behind them. She dropped low, slid beneath a fallen tree and fired upward. 2 soldiers fell, their bodies jerking as rounds punched through their armor. She grabbed one of their grenades, yanked the pin and lobbed it into the approaching squad. The explosion shook the forest and screams followed. Drones swooped low, their sensors scanning wildly through the chaos. She raised the stolen rifle and fired a precise shot, and one drone spiraled into the trees, flames licking at its shattered frame. The second she disabled with a well-placed EMP dart, sending it crashing to the ground in silence. By now the hunters were panicking. Their radios were jammed, their formation shredded, and their numbers dropping fast. She could hear their fear in the clipped way they shouted orders, the frantic bursts of gunfire that hit nothing but trees. They weren't hunting her anymore. They were trying to survive. She sprinted uphill, her movements fast and fluid, every step perfectly calculated. She knew the terrain now, knew every ridge, every choke point. Ahead was the clearing where they'd planned to extract her, a trap that would soon become their graveyard. She arrived ahead of them, her mind already spinning strategies. The clearing was wide and open, bathed in the pale glow of moonlight. A helicopter waited at its center, its rotors idling softly. The pilot was scanning the perimeter nervously, unaware that the hunter they sought was already here. She slipped through the shadows to the treeline, crouched low and set her pack down. From it, she pulled a compact launcher barely larger than her forearm, and loaded a single rocket. She took aim at the helicopter's tail rotor and fired. The explosion lit the night sky, a thunderous roar followed by a shower of sparks. The helicopter spun violently before smashing into the ground, a ball of fire consuming it. The shockwave rippled through the clearing, and the soldiers who had been herding her into this trap froze in disbelief. That hesitation was all she needed. She darted from the treeline, a blur of motion, rifle steady in her hands. She fired in controlled bursts, each shot finding its mark. The first 2 squads fell before they even realized where the attack was coming from. A third squad tried to regroup, but she lobbed a smoke grenade into their midst, vanishing into the fog before they could retaliate. She moved like a shadow, striking from all angles, her presence everywhere and nowhere at once. The chaos was complete. The forest that had been so silent hours before was now a war zone. Flames licked at the wreckage of the helicopter, smoke curled through the clearing, and the screams of the wounded filled the night. She felt no remorse. These were not innocents. They were predators sent to capture her, soldiers trained to kill without hesitation. She had been one of them once. That life was gone now. She slipped behind a tree and crouched low, swapping magazines with practiced speed. A bullet tore through the bark inches from her head, spraying her with splinters. She rolled out of cover, dropped to one knee and fired, the soldier who had taken the shot crumpling instantly. She kept moving, never staying in one place long enough for them to get a clear fix on her position. A voice barked orders over a loudspeaker, desperate, commanding. Whoever was leading this mission had finally realized what they were up against. They were trying to rally their men to bring some order to the chaos. She located the source, a soldier with heavier armor standing near the edge of the clearing, barking into a comm device. She lined up her shot and squeezed the trigger. The leader fell and with him the last semblance of order. The enemy broke. Some fled into the forest, others dropped their weapons and froze. She didn't chase them. She wasn't here for slaughter, she was here to end this. In the distance she could hear reinforcements inbound, vehicles, more helicopters. She didn't have long. She moved quickly to the wreckage of the helicopter, scanning its charred remains. Amid the smoke she found what she was looking for, a steel case, scorched but intact. She smashed the lock with the butt of her rifle and flipped it open. Inside were documents, data drives and a photo of her face. They'd built an entire operation around her capture. She stuffed the case into her pack and turned back toward the forest. The night was alive with distant gunfire, but none of it was close. She was already gone. She ran with the wind at her back, her body moving on instinct, navigating the treacherous terrain without slowing. She could feel the adrenaline fading, replaced by the steady focus of survival. She dismantled their trap, but this was only the beginning. Whoever wanted her had resources, information, and a determination that matched her own. As she reached the ridge overlooking the valley, she paused, crouching low to catch her breath. Below her, the forest glowed faintly from fires burning in the clearing, smoke curling into the sky like a warning signal. She could hear distant sirens and engines approaching, more hunters flooding into the area. She smiled faintly, her face illuminated by moonlight. They thought they'd cornered her. Instead, she had turned their perfect operation into chaos. Tonight, she had reminded them why they feared her name. With one last glance at the burning clearing, she vanished into the trees, her movements silent and deliberate. By the time the reinforcements arrived, she would be miles away, another ghost story whispered among soldiers who had seen death itself walk through their ranks. But she wasn't finished. Not yet. This was only the first step. And now she had their attention. The end.